from privilege to poverty. The Golden Life. Victoria Ashford stood on the balcony of her penthouse apartment, looking down at the city of Chicago spread beneath her like a kingdom. At 28 years old, she had everything. Designer clothes filled 3 walk-in closets. A Mercedes sat in her private parking space. Her father, Richard Ashford, owned Ashford Industries, a tech company worth billions. Victoria served as vice president of operations, though everyone knew she'd gotten the position because of her last name, not her qualifications. She lived in a bubble of privilege, surrounded by people who praised her every word and laughed at her every joke. She dined at restaurants where meals cost more than most people's monthly rent. She vacationed in Paris, Milan, and Tokyo. She never thought about money because she'd never had to. It simply appeared whenever she needed it, endless and automatic like breathing. But Victoria wasn't just wealthy. She was cruel. She treated employees like servants, snapping her fingers when she wanted coffee, firing people on a whim when they displeased her. She believed money made her superior, that her wealth proved she was smarter and better than everyone else. Her father had taught her that success meant standing above others, and she'd learned that lesson well. The Cruel Game. The annual Ashford Industries Gala was held at the Grand Horizon Hotel, a glittering event where executives and employees gathered for an evening of celebration. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. A string quartet played classical music. Servers circulated with champagne and appetizers. Victoria wore a red dress that cost $12,000. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and wrists. She stood near the bar, surrounded by her usual group of admirers, when she noticed Marcus Chin across the room. Marcus was a project manager in the development department. He'd worked at Ashford Industries for 5 years, always arriving early and staying late. He was quiet, hard-working, and respected by his colleagues. He wore an inexpensive suit that he'd probably owned for years, and he stood alone near the windows, looking uncomfortable in the crowd. Victoria had never liked Marcus. He didn't laugh at her jokes. He didn't compliment her outfits. He treated her with professional courtesy but nothing more, and his indifference irritated her like a grain of sand in an oyster. She wanted everyone to admire her, to need her approval, and Marcus's quiet dignity felt like a challenge. She'd been drinking champagne all evening, and the alcohol made her bold and reckless. She turned to her friends and said loudly, "Watch this." Then she walked across the room toward Marcus, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The crowd parted for her. Conversations quieted. People sensed something was about to happen. Marcus saw her coming and straightened, his expression cautious. Victoria stopped in front of him and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Marcus Chen, isn't it? I've been reviewing your performance, and honestly, I'm disappointed. Your work is mediocre at best. You're coasting on the company's generosity." Marcus's face remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. "Miss Ashford, I believe my last 3 projects were all completed ahead of schedule and under budget. The client satisfaction ratings are irrelevant," Victoria interrupted. She enjoyed the way people were watching, the power she felt in this moment. "What matters is that I don't think you're a good fit for Ashford Industries anymore. You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The room went silent. Marcus stood very still, processing her words. Then he nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply said, "I see. Thank you for the opportunity to work here, Miss Ashford. I hope you find someone better suited for the position." He turned and walked toward the exit with his head held high, his dignity intact. Despite the public humiliation, security guards flanked him, though they looked uncomfortable with their task. The crowd watched him go, and then conversations resumed, people whispering about what they'd just witnessed. Victoria returned to her friends, expecting congratulations and laughter. But their faces looked uncertain, even disapproving. One of them, a woman named Jessica, said quietly, "Victoria, that was harsh." Marcus is a good employee. Why would you fire him like that? Victoria waved her hand dismissively. He annoyed me. That's reason enough. She took another glass of champagne from a passing server and drank deeply, pushing away the small, uncomfortable feeling in her chest that might have been shame. Karma's swift hand. 3 days later, Victoria's world began to collapse. She was having lunch at her favorite restaurant when her phone rang. It was her father's assistant, her voice tight with panic. Miss Ashford, you need to come to the hospital immediately. Your father collapsed in his office. They're saying it's a stroke. Victoria's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. She ran from the restaurant, leaving her designer purse behind, and drove to the hospital with her hands shaking on the wheel. She found her father in the intensive care unit, his face pale and slack, machines beeping around his bed. The doctors said he'd survive, but the damage was severe. He would need months of rehabilitation. He couldn't run the company anymore. While her father fought for his life, business rivals moved like sharks smelling blood in the water. Ashford Industries had enemies, other tech companies that had waited years for an opportunity like this. Within a week, they launched a coordinated attack. They spread rumors about financial instability. They contacted major clients and offered better deals. They bought up company stock and demanded changes to the board of directors. Victoria tried to hold everything together. But she'd never actually run the company. She'd attended meetings and signed papers her father told her to sign, but she didn't understand the business. She didn't know how to negotiate with investors or manage crises. She made desperate decisions that made things worse. She fired people she thought were disloyal, creating chaos in the ranks. She took out emergency loans at terrible interest rates. She fought battles she didn't know how to win. Rock bottom. 6 months after her father's stroke, Ashford Industries was sold to a rival company in a hostile takeover. The new owners immediately restructured everything. They fired the entire executive team, including Victoria. They sold off assets to pay debts. They moved operations to a different city. The company her father had built over 30 years was dismantled in a matter of weeks. The financial destruction was total and merciless. The emergency loans Victoria had taken were called in, and she couldn't pay them. The bank foreclosed on her penthouse apartment. Her Mercedes was repossessed. Her credit cards were cancelled. Her bank accounts, once overflowing with money, were frozen and emptied to pay creditors. Everything vanished like smoke and wind. Her friends disappeared even faster than her money. The people who had surrounded her at parties and galas, who had laughed at her jokes and praised her style, suddenly didn't return her calls. Invitations stopped coming. When she showed up at her favorite restaurant, the hostess told her coldly that her membership had been revoked due to unpaid bills. She realized with crushing clarity that she'd never had real friends, only people who enjoyed her money and status. She moved into a motel on the outskirts of Chicago, a grim place with stained carpets and flickering lights. She lay awake at night listening to traffic and sirens, trying to understand how her life had fallen apart so completely. Her father was still in rehabilitation, unable to help her even if he wanted to. She had no other family, no one to turn to. She was alone with nothing but the clothes in her suitcase and the crushing weight of her failures. Desperate measures. Victoria needed work, any work, just to survive. She'd never had a real job before, never filled out an application or sat through an interview. She'd gone straight from college to a vice president position at her father's company. Now she walked the streets of Chicago, going from business to business, asking if they were hiring. The responses were brutal and consistent. Some managers recognized her name and laughed in her face. Victoria Ashford? The woman who destroyed her father's company? No thanks. Others saw her resume, with its single entry showing 5 years as vice president of a failed corporation, and politely declined. We're looking for someone with more diverse experience. Still others simply sensed that she had no real skills, that she'd coasted on privilege her entire life, and they didn't want to waste their time training someone so obviously unprepared for ordinary work. She applied for retail positions, waitress jobs, office assistant roles. She was rejected from all of them. Her money ran out. She couldn't pay for another week at the motel. She spent 2 nights sleeping in her car, a beat-up Honda she'd bought for $800 from a stranger on Craigslist. She parked in a grocery store lot and tried to sleep sitting up, waking every hour when someone walked past or a car alarm went off. On the 3rd morning, hungry and desperate, she walked into a small cafe called the Common Ground. It was located in a working-class neighborhood, a simple place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. The smell of coffee and fresh bread made her stomach clench with hunger. She approached the counter, ready to ask about job openings, and froze. The unexpected offer. Behind the counter, wearing an apron and making espresso with practiced ease, was Marcus Chin. The man she'd publicly humiliated and fired 6 months ago. The man whose life she'd tried to ruin out of boredom and spite. Marcus looked up, saw her, and went very still. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the counter. Victoria's face burned with shame. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her legs wouldn't move. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She had nowhere else to go. Marcus set down the espresso cup he'd been holding. His expression was unreadable, carefully neutral. "Victoria Ashford," he said quietly. "I heard about what happened to your father and the company. I'm sorry." Victoria's throat tightened. She hadn't expected kindness, and it shattered something inside her. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Any work. I know you have no reason to help me. I know what I did to you was unforgivable. But I'm asking anyway. Please." Marcus studied her face. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the rumpled clothes she'd been wearing for days, the desperation that made her stand before him with her pride in pieces. He should have felt satisfaction. He should have turned her away and let her suffer the way she'd made others suffer. But Marcus had never been a cruel person. He'd learned long ago that revenge tasted like ashes. "We need someone to wash dishes," he said finally. "It's minimum wage, 6 days a week. You'll work evenings, closing time is 10. The work is hard and hot and your hands will get raw from the soap. Are you willing to do that?" Victoria nodded so hard her hair fell into her face. "Yes. Thank you. I'll work hard, I promise." Marcus pulled out an application form and slid it across the counter. "Fill this out. You can start tomorrow night." Swallowing pride. Victoria found a room to rent in a house 8 blocks from the cafe. It was tiny, barely large enough for a single bee. And a dresser, with a shared bathroom down the hall. But it was clean and safe, and the landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Garcia, accepted her first month's rent in cash and didn't ask questions about her past. That first night at the Common Ground, Victoria learned what real work felt like. She stood at an industrial sink for 4 hours, scrubbing pots and pans and dishes in water so hot it turned her hands red. Her back ached. Her feet throbbed. Grease splattered on her shirt. She smelled like dish soap and old food. When closing time finally came, she could barely stand. Marcus found her leaning against the wall in the kitchen, fighting back tears of exhaustion. He handed her a sandwich wrapped in paper. "You didn't eat dinner. Take this. You need your strength." Victoria looked at the sandwich, then at Marcus. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "After what I did?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. What you did hurt me, but I healed. I moved on. And right now, you need help. That's all that matters." Victoria ate the sandwich sitting on the back steps of the cafe, looking up at the Chicago sky. The stars were hidden behind city lights and clouds, but she could imagine them there, constant and distant. She thought about the person she'd been 6 months ago, cruel and careless, and felt like she was looking at a stranger. That Victoria had died in the ruins of Ashford Industries. This new Victoria, tired and humbled and grateful for a sandwich, was someone she didn't yet know. But maybe that was okay. Maybe not knowing who you were meant you could become someone better. She finished the sandwich, wiped her eyes, and walked home through the quiet streets. Tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again. And somehow, that thought didn't terrify her. It felt almost like hope. Learning what matters. Hard lessons. The first 2 weeks at the common ground nearly broke Victoria. Her body wasn't used to physical labor. Her hands developed blisters that burst and bled, then calloused over. Her back ached from standing hunched over the sink. She came home each night and collapsed on her bed, too tired to even shower. Mrs. Garcia knocked on her door one evening with a jar of salve for her hands and a knowing look that said she'd seen this kind of exhaustion before. But Victoria kept showing up. She arrived 15 minutes early every shift and stayed late to make sure everything was perfectly clean. She learned the rhythm of the kitchen, when the rush hit, when things slowed down. She learned which pots needed extra scrubbing and which plates chipped easily. She stopped wearing her last remaining designer watch because it got soaked and ruined. She tied her hair back with a rubber band instead of a silk scarf. She became invisible in the way working people often are, just another body doing necessary work. The other employees treated her with cautious distance at first. They'd heard rumors about who she used to be, whispers about the rich girl who'd lost everything. But Victoria didn't act superior or entitled. She didn't complain about the work or ask for special treatment. She just kept her head down and did her job, and slowly, gradually, they began to accept her presence. Marcus never mentioned their past. He treated her the same way he treated every employee, with quiet respect and fair expectations. If she did good work, he thanked her. If she made mistakes, he corrected her gently. He never lorded his position over her or made her feel small. His kindness was steady and genuine, without any hint of smugness or revenge. It confused Victoria. She'd expected him to enjoy her fall, to savor her humiliation. Instead, he simply treated her like a person. Marcus's kindness. One evening during her third week, Victoria dropped an entire tray of plates. They shattered across the kitchen floor in an explosion of ceramic shards. She froze, staring at the mess, panic rising in her chest. At Ashford Industries, mistakes like this had meant immediate firing, harsh words, public humiliation. She waited for Marcus to yell at her, to tell her she was useless. Marcus appeared in the doorway, surveyed the broken plates, and just said, "Are you hurt?" Victoria shook her head, unable to speak. Marcus grabbed a broom and dustpan. "Then let's clean this up. It happens to everyone eventually. These plates are old anyway. We needed to replace them." They swept up the pieces together in silence. When the floor was clean, Marcus said, "My first week working in a kitchen, I dropped 3 trays of glasses. My boss at the time laughed and said I was trying to redecorate the floor." "Don't worry about it, Victoria. You're doing fine." Something in Victoria's chest loosened. She'd been carrying so much fear and shame, waiting for punishment that never came. She realized that Marcus wasn't just being professional. He was genuinely kind, in a way she'd never encountered in her old life. The people she'd known before were kind only when it benefited them, when they wanted something in return. Marcus asked for nothing. He simply saw her struggling and chose to ease that struggle when he could. She started watching him more carefully after that. She noticed how he greeted every customer by name, how he remembered their usual orders and asked about their families. She saw him give free coffee to the homeless man who sat on the bench outside, never making a show of it, just sliding the cup across with a quiet nod. She watched him stay late to help the baker, Rosa, carry supplies when her back was hurting. She observed him tutoring a teenage employee named Tommy in math during slow afternoons, helping him study for his GED. Marcus had been nothing at Ashford Industries, just another employee in a massive corporation. But here, in this small cafe in this working-class neighborhood, he was essential. People relied on him. They trusted him. They came to the cafe not just for coffee but for the warmth of his presence. Victoria realized she'd never inspired that kind of loyalty or affection. People had obeyed her out of fear or because they wanted her money, never because they genuinely cared about her. The cafe family. The common ground employed 6 people including Marcus. There was Rosa, the baker, a 50-year-old woman from Mexico with hands scarred from years of hard work. She arrived at 4 every morning to make bread and pastries, filling the cafe with the smell of cinnamon and vanilla. She was a single mother raising 3 kids on her own, her husband having left years ago. She worked 12-hour days and never complained, always had a smile for customers and encouraging words for her coworkers. James worked the morning shift at the counter. He was a retired high school English teacher in his 70s, working part-time because his pension wasn't enough to cover his medical bills. He read poetry during slow moments and had a gentle way of talking to customers that made everyone feel heard and important. He spoke 4 languages and sometimes helped immigrant customers who struggled with English. Tommy was 17, thin and nervous with haunted eyes. He'd aged out of foster care at 16 and lived in a group home while trying to finish his education. He worked as a busboy and dishwasher on weekends, saving money for community college. He was shy and skittish, flinching when people moved too quickly near him. But he worked hard and never missed a shift. There was Keisha, a nursing student in her 20s who worked evenings to pay her tuition. She was fierce and funny, always playing music in the kitchen and dancing between orders. She dreamed of becoming a pediatric nurse and working with sick children. She brought that same care to her work at the cafe, remembering customer preferences and making people feel special. And finally, there was David, the weekend barista, a musician who played guitar at local bars and open mic nights. He was in his 30s, still chasing his dreams despite years of rejection from record labels. He made elaborate latte art and told terrible jokes that somehow always made people laugh. These people became Victoria's world. She learned their stories during late-night closing shifts, during quiet moments between rushes. She learned about Rosa's daughter's quinceañera that she was saving up for. She learned about James's late wife and how he still talked to her photo every morning. She learned about Tommy's nightmares and Keisha's exhaustion from pulling all-nighters studying. She learned about David's upcoming gig at a venue that might finally lead somewhere. She'd never known people like this before. In her old life, everyone had been wealthy, comfortable, insulated from real struggle. These people fought every day just to survive, and yet they still found reasons to laugh, to care about each other, to show up and do good work. They shared food when someone was broke. They covered shifts when someone was sick. They celebrated small victories and mourned shared losses. They were a family, not by blood but by choice and circumstance. A different education. One evening, Victoria noticed Tommy struggling with homework during his break. He sat at a corner table with a math textbook, his forehead creased with frustration, erasing the same problem over and over. She'd just finished her shift and was about to leave when something made her stop. "Do you need help?" she asked, approaching his table cautiously. Tommy looked up, startled, then embarrassed. "It's algebra. I don't understand it. I've watched videos online, but nothing makes sense." Victoria sat down across from him. She'd been good at math in school, one of the few subjects where her natural intelligence actually showed. "May I see?" Tommy pushed the textbook toward her, and she studied the problem. Then she found a blank piece of paper and began explaining, breaking down the equation into simple steps, showing him how to isolate variables and balance both sides. Tommy watched her work, and slowly his expression shifted from frustration to understanding. "Oh," he said. "Oh, I get it now. It's like a puzzle. You have to figure out what goes where." "Exactly," Victoria said. She worked through 2 more problems with him, then let him try one alone. He solved it correctly, and his face lit up with pride. I did it. I actually did it. Victoria felt something warm bloom in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name at first. Then she realized it was satisfaction, but a different kind than she'd ever known. Not the shallow pleasure of buying something expensive or being praised at a party, but the deep contentment of helping someone, of using her knowledge to make someone else's life better. After that, she started arriving early to her shifts to help Tommy with his homework. They worked together on math and English, history, and science. Tommy was smart, but he'd never had consistent schooling, moved from foster home to foster home throughout his childhood. No one had ever taken the time to teach him properly. Victoria discovered she was good at explaining things, patient in ways she'd never been before. Word spread. Soon Keisha was asking for help with her nursing school statistics. David wanted advice on how to write a business plan for a potential music studio. Even Rosa, working on her citizenship test, asked Victoria to quiz her on American history and government. Victoria found herself becoming a tutor, a teacher, a resource. People came to her with questions and problems, trusting her to help. It was the first time in her life that people valued her mind rather than her money. The Secret Project. One Saturday afternoon, Victoria finished her shift early and decided to walk around the neighborhood. She'd been so focused on work and survival that she hadn't really explored the area. She wandered past bodegas and laundromats, past a small park where kids played basketball, past a community center with faded paint and cracked windows. She heard Marcus's voice coming from inside the community center and stopped, curious. She peered through the window and saw him standing in front of 20 teenagers, a whiteboard behind him covered in notes and diagrams. He was teaching a business class. Victoria watched for several minutes, fascinated. Marcus explained market research and customer demographics with the same patient clarity he used at the cafe. The teenagers listened intently, taking notes, asking questions. He talked about his own experience, how he'd worked his way up from entry-level positions, how he'd saved money to start the Common Ground, how he'd learned from failures and setbacks. After the class ended, Victoria waited outside. Marcus emerged carrying his materials and saw her standing there. He didn't look surprised or embarrassed, just nodded in greeting. "How long have you been doing this?" Victoria asked. 3 years, Marcus said. "I teach business basics and financial literacy every Saturday. A lot of kids in this neighborhood don't have access to that kind of education. I figured if I could give them the tools I wish I'd had when I was younger, maybe it would help them build better futures." Victoria thought about the thousands of dollars she'd spent on single dresses, single dinners, single bottles of champagne. Marcus made minimum wage at his own cafe so he could keep prices affordable for the neighborhood, and he spent his free time teaching teenagers for free. The contrast made her ashamed and awed in equal measure. "Could I help?" she asked impulsively. "I have business experience, even if I misused it before. Maybe I could teach something?" Marcus studied her face. Then he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I think they'd benefit from hearing your story. About privilege, about failure, about learning to start over. That's a valuable lesson. Changing perspective." Victoria started volunteering at the community center every Saturday. She co-taught with Marcus, sharing her knowledge of business operations, marketing, financial planning. But more importantly, she shared her story honestly. She told these teenagers about growing up wealthy, about taking everything for granted, about treating people badly because she thought her money made her superior. She told them about losing everything and having to start over with nothing. "I thought wealth made me better than other people," she said to a classroom of kids who watched her with sharp, knowing eyes. "I thought money was what mattered most in life. I was wrong. Money is a tool, nothing more. What matters is how you treat people, what you do with your opportunities, whether you use your advantages to lift others up or push them down. I failed that test spectacularly. I'm trying to do better now." The teenagers asked blunt questions. Do you regret being mean to people? Would you go back to being rich if you could? What's the hardest part about being poor? Victoria answered honestly, without defensiveness or excuses. She admitted her regrets. She acknowledged that parts of poverty were brutal and exhausting. But she also talked about what she'd gained, the relationships and perspectives she'd never had before. One girl, maybe 15 years old with bright eyes and a skeptical expression, raised her hand. If you got rich again tomorrow, would you still be nice to people? Or would you go back to being terrible? Victoria thought carefully before answering. I hope I'd stay nice. I hope I've changed enough that wealth wouldn't corrupt me again. But honestly? I don't know for sure. It's easy to be humble when you have no other choice. The real test would be choosing humility when I could choose power instead. I hope I'd pass that test, but I can't promise. All I can do is try to be better today than I was yesterday. The girl nodded, satisfied with the honesty. After class, she approached Victoria and said, I like that you didn't lie and say you're definitely a good person now. Most adults lie about stuff like that. Victoria felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. Her life developed a new rhythm. She worked her evening shifts at the cafe, helped Tommy and others with homework, taught at the community center on Saturdays, spent Sundays doing laundry and reading books borrowed from James. She had no money for entertainment, so she learned to find joy in simple things. Walking through the neighborhood in the evening. Listening to David play guitar during cafe closing time. Sharing meals with Rosa and her children, simple food that tasted better than any expensive restaurant she'd visited before. She was exhausted all the time, her body aching from work, her mind tired from constant worry about money. But she was also, surprisingly, often happy. Not the frantic, hollow happiness of her old life, chasing the next party or purchase, but a quiet contentment that came from being useful, from being part of a community, from knowing she was becoming someone better. Unexpected feelings. Victoria began to notice Marcus in a new way. She'd always seen him as the man she'd wronged, the victim of her cruelty. But as weeks turned into months, she started seeing him simply as Marcus. She noticed the way he moved through the cafe with quiet efficiency, never rushed but never wasting time. She noticed his hands, strong and scarred from years of kitchen work, gentle when he handed change to elderly customers. She noticed his smile, rare but genuine, transforming his serious face into something warm and open. She noticed how he listened when people talked, really listened, giving them his full attention as if nothing else mattered in that moment. She noticed how kids in the neighborhood ran up to him on the street, excited to show him. I can do is try to be better today than I was yesterday. The girl nodded, satisfied with the honesty. After class, she approached Victoria and said, I like that you didn't lie and say you're definitely a good person now. Most adults lie about stuff like that. Victoria felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. Her life developed a new rhythm. She worked her evening shifts at the cafe, helped Tommy and others with homework, taught at the community center on Saturdays, spent Sundays doing laundry and reading books borrowed from James. She had no money for entertainment, so she learned to find joy in simple things. Walking through the neighborhood in the evening. Listening to David play guitar during cafe closing time. Sharing meals with Rosa and her children, simple food that tasted better than any expensive restaurant she'd visited before. She was exhausted all the time, her body aching from work, her mind tired from constant worry about money. But she was also, surprisingly, often happy. Not the frantic, hollow happiness of her old life, chasing the next party or purchase, but a quiet contentment that came from being useful, from being part of a community, from knowing she was becoming someone better. Unexpected feelings. Victoria began to notice Marcus in a new way. She'd always seen him as the man she'd wronged, the victim of her cruelty. But as weeks turned into months, she started seeing him simply as Marcus. She noticed the way he moved through the cafe with quiet efficiency, never rushed but never wasting time. She noticed his hands, strong and scarred from years of kitchen work, gentle when he handed change to elderly customers. She noticed his smile, rare but genuine, transforming his serious face into something warm and open. She noticed how he listened when people talked, really listened, giving them his full attention as if nothing else mattered in that moment. She noticed how kids in the neighborhood ran up to him on the street, excited to show him their report cards or tell him about their soccer games. She noticed how he remembered everyone's name, everyone's story, carrying the weight of their lives in his heart without ever making it about himself. She found herself watching for him when she arrived for her shifts, feeling a small lift in her spirits when she saw him behind the counter. She volunteered for extra hours on days he was working. She laughed at his occasional dry jokes, the kind of quiet humor that snuck up on you. She found herself thinking about him at night in her small room, wondering about his life outside the cafe, wondering if he ever felt lonely like she did. Story. About privilege, about failure, about learning to start over. That's a valuable lesson. Changing perspective. One evening, they were closing together. Everyone else had left, and they worked in comfortable silence, Victoria washing the last dishes while Marcus counted the register and prepared the deposit. The radio played softly, some old jazz station that David always left on. Rain drummed against the windows, turning the street outside into a blur of lights and shadows. Marcus finished with the register and came to help Victoria with the last few pots. They stood side by side at the sink, their hands occasionally touching in the soapy water. Neither of them moved away. Victoria's heart beat faster, and she wondered if he felt it too, this electricity between them. "Thank you," Marcus said suddenly. Victoria looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For changing. For trying. I know it hasn't been easy, and I know you didn't have to. You could have left Chicago, started over somewhere else where no one knew you. But you stayed. You faced what you did and worked to become better. That takes courage." Victoria's throat tightened with emotion. She set down the pot she'd been washing and turned to face him fully. "You gave me a chance when you had every right to refuse. You've been kind when you could have been cruel. I don't understand why, but I'm grateful. You saved my life, Marcus. Maybe not in a dramatic way, but you saved it nonetheless." They stood close together in the dim kitchen, water dripping from their hands, the rain falling outside. Marcus reached up and tucked a strand of wet hair behind Victoria's ear, his touch soft and careful. "I didn't save your life," he said quietly. "You did that yourself. I just gave you a place to start." Victoria's breath caught. She realized she was falling in love with him, had been falling for weeks without admitting it. She loved his kindness, his strength, the way he moved through the world with purpose and compassion. She loved how he made her want to be better, not through judgment or criticism, but simply by example. She loved the way he saw potential in people, including her. But she didn't say any of that. It was too soon, too complicated. She'd hurt him badly once. He'd forgiven her and given her a chance, but that didn't mean he had romantic feelings for her. She wouldn't burden him with expectations or make their working relationship uncomfortable. So she just smiled and said, "Thank you anyway." They finished closing and walked out into the rain together. Marcus offered her a ride home, and she accepted. They drove through the quiet streets, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. When he pulled up in front of her house, Victoria hesitated before getting out. "Marcus? Do you ever think about what might have been different? If we'd met under other circumstances?" Marcus looked at her in the dim light from the street lamp. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I think we met exactly when we were supposed to. The people we were before couldn't have understood each other. Maybe we needed those experiences, both of us, to become the people we are now." Victoria nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." She got out of the car and ran through the rain to her door. Inside, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, her heart. The heart's true worth. The opportunity. 6 months after Victoria started working at the Common Ground, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was her father's assistant, Margaret, calling from the rehabilitation center. Victoria, your father wants to see you. He's been working with speech therapists and physical therapists. He's much better now, and he has something important to discuss with you. Victoria's hands trembled as she hung up. She hadn't seen her father since the day after his stroke, when he'd been unconscious in the hospital bed. She'd tried to visit once during her first month at the motel, but Margaret had told her that Richard didn't want to see her, that he blamed her for the company's collapse. The rejection had hurt worse than losing everything else combined. She told Marcus she needed a day off and took 3 buses to reach the rehabilitation center on the north side of the city. The facility was expensive and elegant, nothing like the grim motel where Victoria had stayed. She wondered how her father was paying for it, then remembered he'd probably hidden assets before the bankruptcy, protected money in ways she'd never understood. Richard Ashford sat in a wheelchair by a window overlooking a garden. He'd lost weight, and his face sagged on one side, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He studied Victoria as she entered, taking in her thrift store clothes and calloused hands, her simple ponytail and bare face without makeup. "You look different," he said. His speech was slurred but understandable. "You look real." Victoria sat in the chair across from him, her back straight. "How are you, Dad?" "Alive," he said. "Barely, but alive. The doctors say I'm lucky." "I don't feel lucky." He paused, struggling with the words. "I've been thinking a lot these past months. About the company, about what I taught you, about the way we lived. I think I made